At what point in your life does God finally declare you justified? There are basically only two kinds of people in the world: sinners who are justified and sinners who are not. The defining difference is how much righteousness they possess. When a sinner comes to faith in Christ, immediate changes begin, and acts of righteousness necessarily flow from the life of the once unsaved sinner. But how long must believers wait before they're considered just in God's eyes? Today on Renewing Your Mind, we're continuing our series entitled Understanding the Gospel. Dr. Sproul will reaffirm the sole grounds of a sinner's justification. Here's our teacher with today's message: the righteousness of Christ.
Today we're going to continue our exposition of the celebration of the gospel, the document that has been now signed by well over 100 leading evangelical persons in America. And we've looked already at the first 12 articles of affirmation and denial. And today we will begin with article number 13. Article 13 reads as follows: "We affirm that the righteousness of Christ, by which we are justified, is properly his own, which he achieved apart from us in and by his perfect obedience. This righteousness is counted, reckoned, or imputed to us by the forensic, that is, legal, declaration of God as the sole ground of our justification. We deny that any works we perform at any stage of our existence add to the merit of Christ or earn for us any merit that contributes in any way to the ground of our justification." Now, at first glance, it may seem that all that Article 13 does is duplicate what was affirmed in Article 12, because in Article 12 we saw the affirmation that the ground of our justification is based on the imputation of the righteousness of Christ, and that the ground of our justification is not found in any righteousness that inheres within us. But again, this issue of imputation and the role of Christ in our justification is so central to our understanding of the gospel that the framers of this document felt that it was necessary to become even more precise in Article 13 to make sure that there is no possible disagreement about what was meant in Article 12. And so it says that we affirm that the righteousness of Christ by which we are justified is properly his own. Now that means that it is not the righteousness of Christ in us, but it is the righteousness of Christ for us. It's not the working of righteousness within our souls that Christ does that justifies us, but when we talk about being justified by the imputation of the righteousness of Christ, the righteousness we're speaking of here is the righteousness that Christ achieved apart from us, outside of us, in the living of his own life. Now, the document says that he achieved this righteousness in and by his perfect obedience. Now, historically, theologians have made a distinction. Well, isn't that an understatement? Historically, that's about all theologians ever do, is make distinctions. But here, the theologians have made a distinction between two kinds of obedience of Christ. One is called the passive obedience of Christ, and the other is called his perfect active obedience. Now, that distinction does not find its way into this document, but certainly it lurks just slightly beneath the surface and is the historical background for this statement. The difference between the passive obedience and the active obedience of Christ is this. In the term passive obedience, it has to do with what happened to Jesus, where he was the recipient of action, and that is to say, it refers to his submission to the punishment for sin that he received at the hands of God while on the cross. That is his passive obedience, where he submits to and acquiesces to the call of God to be on the receiving end of God's judgment in our behalf. The active obedience refers to the course of his entire life, wherein he actively pursued perfect righteousness by obeying the law of God at every point and in every detail. When Luther spoke about the righteousness by which we are justified, he used two Latin terms that I believe were very important and also instructive for our understanding of justification. The one was the term justitium alienum, which being translated means a foreign or alien righteousness. And when he talks about a justitium alienum, he refers to a righteousness that is achieved by another. It is somebody else's righteousness, not our own, properly speaking. But again, as the document says, the righteousness by which we are justified is that righteousness of Christ that is properly his own. It is not properly our own. We only receive it by imputation. And the second phrase that Luther used was even simpler. He used the term extra nos. When we think about aliens or ETs, extraterrestrials, we think about somebody from another realm, somebody who is apart from us, somebody who's strange and foreign to us. Well, in the first phrase, justitium alienum, Luther refers to the righteousness of Jesus, who is not ourself, and then that justification is based on a righteousness that is extra nos, that means outside of us or apart from us. Again, trying to be very clear that the righteousness that is the ground of our justification is not a righteousness that is found in us, but it's a righteousness that is achieved for us by Christ. Then we read that this righteousness is counted, reckoned, or imputed to us by the legal declaration of God as the sole ground of our justification. It is the righteousness of Christ that is the ground of our justification and the only ground of our justification. And it's not something that we can add to or subtract from.